The rain came down in sheets that August night in 1955, drumming against the tin roof of the Sutton farmhouse with a rhythm that had lulled generations to sleep in this quiet corner of Christian County, Kentucky. Inside, the family gathered after supper, their voices mixing with the percussion of the storm, unaware that within hours, this ordinary evening would transform into one of the most terrifying and well-documented encounters with the unknown in American history. Then the gunfire shattered everything. Imagine 11 people, farmers and factory workers, people who knew the land and trusted what their eyes told them, suddenly barricading themselves inside their own home. Picture them grabbing every weapon they could find, shotguns, rifles, pistols, and firing more than 50 rounds into the darkness beyond their windows. Not at prowlers or wild animals, but at something they could barely comprehend, something that defied every rational explanation their rural Kentucky upbringing had given them. This wasn't a story whispered by a single witness who'd had too much to drink. This wasn't a fleeting light in the sky, gone in seconds, easy to dismiss or explain away. This was a siege that stretched across hours of darkness, a sustained terror that left physical evidence, spent shell casings scattered across the farmhouse floor, bullet holes pockmarking the walls, and 11 traumatized people whose stories would never waver, not across decades of questions, not under the scrutiny of police and military investigators, not even as skeptics tried to tear their accounts apart. What were they shooting at in that darkness? The witnesses described beings unlike anything in their experience. Metallic skin that seemed to shimmer in the shadows, eyes that glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, piercing through the rain and night. Creatures that moved with an unnatural fluidity, appearing at windows, crossing the yard, seemingly immune to bullets that should have torn them apart. Small in stature but terrifying in their persistence, returning again and again despite the barrage of gunfire, as if the family's weapons were nothing more than an inconvenience. The military came. That detail alone should make us pause. When soldiers arrived to investigate a farmhouse siege in rural Kentucky, something significant has happened. When official reports are filed and investigations launched, when the story spreads beyond local gossip to become a matter of government interest, we're forced to ask deeper questions. What evidence convinced authorities this deserved their attention? What did they find that we've never been told? But here's what truly haunts this case, what separates it from countless other strange tales that fade with time. These 11 people never sought fame or fortune from their experience. They didn't sell their story to tabloids or tour the country giving lectures. Most of them wanted nothing more than to forget that night, to return to their quiet lives and never speak of it again. Yet when pressed, when questioned by investigators or journalists or the merely curious, their accounts remained consistent. The details matched. The timeline held. The terror in their voices never diminished, even decades later when age had softened other memory. So we're left with a question that demands an answer, even if that answer unsettles us. What happened on the Sutton Farm that August night? What drove rational people to such desperate action? What stood in that darkness beyond their windows, watching them with glowing eyes, absorbing their bullets and returning for more? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if it happened once in 1955, could it happen again? The rain has long since stopped falling on that Kentucky farmhouse. The witnesses have grown old, some have passed away, taking their trauma to the grave. But the questions remain, suspended in time like the gun smoke that once filled those rooms. And somewhere in the archives, in faded police reports and declassified military documents, in the memories of those who survived that night, the truth waits to be understood. This is the story of the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter, a night when the impossible invaded the ordinary, and 11 people found themselves defending their lives against visitors from beyond human understanding. In the summer of 1955, Christian County, Kentucky existed in a world that feels almost mythical to us now. This was the America of covered dishes at church socials, of handshake agreements that meant something, of neighbors who knew 3 generations of your family history. The heat that August was oppressive, the kind that made the air thick enough to chew, that turned cotton shirts translucent with sweat before breakfast ended. In the fields surrounding the small community of Kelly and nearby Hopkinsville, tobacco plants drooped under the relentless sun, their broad leaves going limp in the afternoon furnace. This was tobacco country, where families measured their year by planting seasons and harvest times, where a man's worth was calculated in acres worked and debts honored. The Sutton family farmhouse sat roughly 8 miles north of Hopkinsville, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that turned to soup when it rained and kicked up choking dust clouds in dry weather. The house itself was typical of rural Kentucky at the time, a weathered wooden structure that had seen better days, but still stood solid, still kept the rain out, and provided shelter for the extended family that lived within its walls. No electricity reached this far out. At night, kerosene lamps cast their amber glow through windows, creating small islands of light in an ocean of darkness. The nearest neighbor lived nearly a mile away, close enough to visit on a Sunday afternoon, but far enough that shouting for help would be pointless. Glennie Langford owned the property, a woman whose reputation in the community was beyond reproach. She was known as a hard worker, a devoted churchgoer, someone who kept her word and raised her children right. Her son, Elmer Sutton, lived at the farmhouse with his wife, and they shared the space with Lucky Sutton, his wife, and several other family members including J.C. Sutton and his wife Elaine, OPA. Baker and his wife, and 3 children who ranged in age from toddlers to early adolescence. These were not the kinds of people who told tall tales or sought attention. They were farmers and laborers, people whose lives revolved around church on Sundays, work from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, and the simple pleasures of family gatherings on the front porch when the day's labor was finally done. Billy Ray Taylor was visiting that weekend, a young man from Pennsylvania who was staying with the Suttons along with his wife. He worked as a carnival employee when he could find the work, but there was nothing flashy or unreliable about him, despite that profession. People who knew Billy Ray described him as earnest and honest, maybe a bit excitable, but not the type to make things up. He was 21 years old that summer, still young enough to see wonder in the world, but old enough to know the difference between imagination and reality. The farmhouse was surrounded by fields on 3 sides, with a thick patch of woods marking the property line to the west. During the day, you could see for quite a distance across those fields, watch the heat shimmer rise off the dark soil and make the horizon dance. But when night fell in rural Kentucky in the 1950s, the darkness was absolute in a way that most people today have never experienced. There were no streetlights, no glow from nearby towns bleeding into the sky, no headlights from passing cars on distant highways. When the sun went down, the world contracted to whatever circle of light your kerosene lamp could cast. And beyond that circle, anything could exist unseen. The people of Christian County took pride in their level-headedness. This was not a community given to hysteria or wild speculation. When someone's barn burned, folks talked about faulty wiring or carelessly stored hay, not arson or conspiracy. When cattle went missing, it was coyotes or thieves, not monsters or government experiments. Faith that bound the community together was practical and grounded. People believed in God, in hard work, in taking care of your own, and in minding your business unless someone needed help. They read their Bibles, and they read the newspaper, and they understood the difference between the two. In 1955, America was still basking in the glow of post-war prosperity, but that modern world felt very far away from the Sutton farmhouse. Television was becoming common in cities, but out here, entertainment meant the radio if you had battery power. Or more often, it meant conversation on the porch, storytelling, singing hymns, playing cards by lamplight. The Korean War had ended 2 years earlier, and while some local boys had gone and not all had come back, life had settled into familiar rhythms again. The biggest news that summer concerned integration and the beginning rumbles of what would become the civil rights movement. But in small farming communities, the concerns were more immediate. Would the tobacco crop yield enough to pay off last year's debts? Would the rain come when it was needed? Would the children stay healthy through another sweltering summer? The Sutton family had no reason to want attention from the outside world. They were private people living private lives, content with their routines and their community. Glennie Langford had worked hard to build a respectable reputation, and her children and their spouses understood the value of that currency in a small town. Your name meant everything. Your word was your bond. Being known as honest, as reliable, as God-fearing, these things mattered more than money, because money could come and go, but your reputation followed you to the grave and beyond. shaping how people remembered you and how they treated your children. The isolation of the farmhouse served them well most of the time. They didn't have to worry about noise disturbing neighbors or about prying eyes watching their business. The children could run and play without danger from traffic or strangers. The adults could work at their own pace, guided by the sun and the seasons rather than by factory whistles or time clocks. But that isolation also meant vulnerability. If something went wrong, if someone got hurt or sick or scared, help was not close at hand. You dealt with problems yourself, or you didn't deal with them at all. On summer nights, the family would gather on the porch after supper, once the worst heat of the day had broken into something merely uncomfortable, rather than unbearable. The children would chase fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying across the fields. The adults would talk quietly about crops and weather and church business, about whose daughter was marrying whose son, about which families were struggling and might need some help come harvest time. Sometimes they would sing hymns, their voices rising into the darkness, carried away on whatever breeze might stir the heavy air. These were good people living good lives, perhaps not easy lives but honest ones, lives built on faith and work and family bond. The woods beyond the western edge of the property remained largely unexplored by the family. There was no reason to go tramping through the timber when all the work that needed doing happened in the fields or around the house. The trees stood as a dark wall at the edge of the known world, rustling and whispering when the wind moved through them, full of the normal sounds of a Kentucky forest at night. Owls calling, branches creaking, the occasional crash of a deer moving through the underbrush. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just the familiar music of the natural world going about its business in the darkness. Christian County itself was deeply rooted in both history and faith. Established in 1797, it had been named for William Christian, a Revolutionary War officer. The county seat of Hopkinsville had a population of around 11,000 souls, making it the commercial and cultural center of the region. People came to town on Saturdays to sell their produce and buy supplies, to catch up on gossip and conduct business. The rest of the week, the rural families lived in relative seclusion, connected by dirt roads and party-line telephones to those lucky enough to have them, but mostly relying on face-to-face contact and the steady rhythms of agricultural life. No one in the Sutton household that August was looking for excitement or adventure. They were not the type to seek the spotlight or to invite scrutiny into their lives. They went to church, they worked their land, they raised their children, and they asked nothing more from the world than to be left alone to live as they saw fit. The very last thing any of them wanted was to become the center of attention, to have their names in newspapers, to have strangers questioning their honesty and their sanity. But on the night of August 21st, 1955, something would happen at that isolated farmhouse that would change everything, that would bring reporters and police and curiosity seekers flooding into their quiet lives, that would make the Sutton family name synonymous with one of the strangest and most controversial incidents in American history. Billy Ray Taylor had been at the Sutton farmhouse less than a week when he volunteered to fetch water from the well that August evening. It was just past 7 o'clock, and the Kentucky sun hung low and heavy, painting the tobacco fields in shades of amber and rust. The well sat about 50 yards from the house, far enough that you felt alone out there, surrounded by nothing but the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the dogwood trees. Billy Ray was 21 years old, new to the area, recently arrived from Pennsylvania with his wife. He was still finding his footing in this rural corner of Christian County, still learning the rhythms of farmhouse life with Glennie Langford's family. The well was old, the kind with a bucket on a rope and a wooden frame that creaked when you worked it. He walked out there alone, probably thinking about nothing more important than getting back inside for supper. What happened next would change his life forever and spark one of the most documented close encounter cases in American history. Billy Ray later said he first noticed the light in his peripheral vision, a brightness that didn't belong to the dying sun. He turned toward the southwest and saw it clearly, a craft moving through the sky with an unusual trajectory, too deliberate to be a meteor, too silent to be an aircraft. He described it as silvery, metallic, reflecting the last rays of daylight. But what captured his attention most was the exhaust, if you could call it that. Colors streamed behind the object, brilliant ribbons of rainbow hues that seemed to shimmer and shift as the craft moved. It wasn't fire. It wasn't smoke. It was something else entirely, something that defied his understanding of how things move through the sky. Billy Ray watched as the craft descended beyond a small gully about a quarter-mile from the farmhouse. It disappeared below the tree line, behind a rise in the land where water sometimes pooled after heavy rains. He didn't hear an explosion. He didn't hear an impact. The craft simply went down and vanished from his sight, leaving him standing there by the well with a bucket in his hand and his heart hammering in his chest. He abandoned his task and ran back to the house, bursting through the door with the news. Inside, the Sutton family was preparing dinner. Glennie Langford was at the stove. Her sons, Elmer and John Sutton, were washing up. Vera Sutton was setting the table while her mother-in-law, Elaine, tended to the younger children. June Taylor, Billy Ray's wife, turned to see her husband breathless and wide-eyed, talking rapidly about what he'd just witnessed. A flying saucer, he told them. A craft with rainbow colors coming out the back. It landed in the gully. The family's reaction was exactly what you might expect from rural farming people in 1955. They smiled. They nodded. Someone probably chuckled. Elmer Sutton, who'd lived on this land his entire life, offered the most reasonable explanation. Billy Ray had seen a shooting star, nothing more. It was the Perseid meteor shower season after all. Bright meteors were common in August. The colors he described could be explained by atmospheric friction, the way meteors burn up as they enter Earth's atmosphere. It made perfect sense. Billy Ray insisted he knew the difference between a meteor and what he'd seen. This thing had moved horizontally, not at the sharp downward angle of a falling star. It had controlled flight, deliberate movement. But his protests fell on politely skeptical ears. The family wasn't mocking him, not exactly. They just weren't taking him seriously. June patted his arm reassuringly. "Come eat," they told him. "You've had a long day." And so Billy Ray Taylor sat down to dinner with the others, his strange sighting already being filed away as a misidentification, a trick of the light, an honest mistake by a young man who hadn't grown up watching these Kentucky skies. The family moved on to other topics. Past the potatoes. How are the tobacco plants looking? Did anyone remember to check on the chickens? Normal conversation, in a normal farmhouse on what should have been a normal summer evening. The next hour passed in mundane comfort. Dishes were cleared and washed. The younger children played on the floor. The men talked about work that needed doing around the property. The women discussed plans for canning vegetables from the garden. Outside, twilight deepened into true darkness. The crickets grew louder. The temperature dropped a few degrees, bringing that pleasant coolness that makes August evenings bearable in the South. No one thought about flying saucers. No one worried about rainbow-colored exhaust or strange craft in the gully. Billy Ray probably felt a little foolish by then, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe he had just seen a meteor after all. Then the dog started barking. It wasn't the normal bark of a dog that's heard a rabbit in the brush, or sensed a possum near the chicken coop. This was frantic, terrified barking, the kind that raises the hair on your arms and makes you stand up without thinking. The dog was outside, somewhere near the back of the house, and its voice carried a note of pure panic that cut through the comfortable evening atmosphere like a knife. Elmer Sutton moved toward the back door. The others followed. Through the window, they could see a strange glow approaching the house, a pale luminescence that didn't move like a lantern or a flashlight. It was steady, hovering, advancing with an eerie purposefulness. The dog's barking reached a crescendo, and then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Elmer opened the back door and stepped onto the small porch. Billy Ray was right behind him. The glow was closer now, and as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they could make out a shape within the light. At first, it seemed impossible, a trick of shadow and illumination playing with their perception. But as the thing moved closer, there could be no mistake about what they were seeing. A creature stood in the yard, approximately 3.5 feet tall, its proportions utterly wrong by human standards. The head was massive, easily accounting for a third of its total height, round and oversized, like a child's drawing brought to horrifying life. But nothing else about this being suggested childishness or innocence. Its eyes glowed yellow, not reflecting light, but generating it, bright and unblinking, and fixed on the two men standing on the porch. The glow was intense enough to see clearly, even at a distance of 30 or 40 feet. Twin points of luminescence that seemed to bore into the observers with unsettling intelligence. The creature's skin appeared metallic, silvery in the dim light, with a texture that witnesses would later struggle to describe. Was it smooth or rough? Scaly or featureless? In the moment, with adrenaline flooding their systems and fear narrowing their focus, such details became difficult to process. What they could see clearly were the arms, raised above the creature's head in a posture that seemed simultaneously defensive and threatening. The hands, if you could call them that, had long fingers or claws that extended upward into the night air. The being didn't make a sound. It didn't advance further, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood there in the yard, bathed in its own pale glow, arms raised overhead, yellow eyes burning in the darkness. The moment stretched out, seconds feeling like minutes, as the men on the porch tried to process what they were seeing, tried to reconcile this impossible figure with everything they knew about the world and what belonged in it. Billy Ray Taylor's shooting star suddenly didn't seem like a misidentification anymore. The craft in the gully, the rainbow exhaust, the silvery metal reflecting the sunset. It all came rushing back, taking on new and terrible significance. This thing in the yard wasn't a neighbor playing a prank. It wasn't a wild animal or a trick of shadow. This was something else entirely. Something that had arrived in that craft. Something that had waited in the darkness for over an hour before approaching the house. Vera Sutton gasped from behind the men, and the sound seemed to break the spell. The creature's head tilted slightly, a movement that was alien in its mechanical precision, as if it was studying them the same way they were studying it. The yellow eyes never blinked. The arms remained raised. And in that moment, standing on the back porch of a Kentucky farmhouse on the night of August 21st, 1955, the Sutton family crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. They had made contact with something beyond their understanding, and the night that followed would become legendary. The dog was nowhere to be seen. The normal sounds of the countryside had gone silent, and the creature with the glowing eyes stood waiting in the yard, as if this encounter had been inevitable all along. The first bullet struck the creature's center mass at close range, and for a heartbeat, Lucky Sutton thought he had killed it. But there was no blood, no cry of pain. Instead, the thing made a sound like metal striking metal, a sharp ringing clang that echoed across the farmyard. The creature flipped backward in a movement so unnatural, so impossibly acrobatic, that Lucky's mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. It tumbled through the air and landed on its feet in the darkness beyond the porch light. Those enormous yellow eyes still fixed on him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Then it scuttled away on all fours toward the tree line with a speed no living thing should possess. Lucky backed into the house, his hands shaking as he held the shotgun. Billy Ray Taylor stood behind him, gripping a .22 caliber rifle, his face pale in the dim electric light. They had both seen it now. Whatever these things were, they were real, and they had come to the Sutton Farm with purposes the men could not fathom. That was how the siege began, on that August night in 1955. In a small farmhouse outside the tiny community of Kelly, Kentucky. What followed would be hours of unrelenting terror that would test the sanity of everyone trapped inside. The creatures did not leave. That was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire ordeal. A normal animal, wounded or frightened by gunfire, would flee and not return. But these entities operated by no natural law that the Sutton family understood. Minutes after Lucky drove the first one away, another appeared at the kitchen window, its clawed hands gripping the wooden frame, its massive head tilting as it studied the people inside. Glennie Langford, Lucky's mother, screamed when she saw it, a raw sound of primal fear that sent the children into hysterics. Billy Ray fired through the window screen, the crack of the rifle deafening in the small kitchen. The glass shattered outward, and once again came that metallic sound, as if the bullet had struck a steel drum rather than flesh. The creature somersaulted backward into the yard, but it did not bleed, did not slow. It simply retreated into the shadows, joining others that the family could now see moving in the darkness beyond the reach of the porch lights. Lucky ran to the back door where movement had caught his eye. Another one crouched on the small porch there, peering through the screen door with those horrible lamp-like eyes. He fired his shotgun from less than 6 feet away, the blast tearing through the screen. The creature flew backward as if yanked by invisible wires, but even as Lucky watched, it righted itself in midair and scurried away with that disturbing insect-like gait. The pattern was established. Shoot them, hit them, watch them fall, and then watch them return, unharmed and undeterred. The family gathered in the center of the house, in the small living room that suddenly felt like the last safe place on Earth. 11 people crowded together, Lucky and his wife, Billy Ray and his wife, Glennie Langford, her daughter Vera, and 5 children ranging in age from 3 to 12. The children cried in confused terror, unable to understand why the men with guns could not make the monsters go away. The women clutched them close, trying to muffle their sobs, but the sound of weeping became another layer in the symphony of nightmare that filled the house. Lucky and Billy Ray positioned themselves to watch multiple angles, but the farmhouse had windows on all sides, doors front and back, and the creatures seemed to know this, seemed to be testing defenses with calculated intelligence. Every few minutes, another would appear, sometimes at a window the men were not watching, sometimes at a door, occasionally on the roof where the family could hear the scraping of claws on shingles, but could do nothing except listen and imagine. The sounds were perhaps worse than the sightings. The scratching on the roof came in deliberate patterns, long, slow drags of something hard against wood, moving from the chimney toward the eaves, then back again. The creatures made noises that Billy Ray would later describe as hissing, but others in the family heard it differently. To Vera, it sounded like high-pitched chattering, almost like speech in a language never meant for human ears. To Glennie, it was a whistling that set her teeth on edge and made her head pound. The sounds came from multiple directions, suggesting that there were several of these things surrounding the house, coordinating their assault in ways that animals simply did not do. Between the creatures' noises came the constant eruption of gunfire. Lucky and Billy Ray fired again and again whenever one of the entities showed itself. The smell of gunpowder filled the house, acrid and choking. Empty shell casings littered the floor, rolling under furniture, crunching under the men's boots as they moved from window to window. They went through box after box of ammunition, firing at targets that refused to die, that seemed to mock the very concept of mortality. The bullets did hit. Both men were experienced shooters, familiar with their weapons, and the range was often point blank. They saw the impacts, saw the creatures react to being struck, but the reactions were all wrong. Sometimes a bullet would hit, and the creature would flip away as if struck by a tremendous force, only to return minutes later without any visible wound. Other times, the bullet seemed to pass straight through with no effect whatsoever, as if the entities were not entirely solid, not fully present in the same physical reality as the humans shooting at them. Most disturbing were the shots that produced that metallic clang, the sound suggesting these things had some kind of armor plating beneath their silver skin, or perhaps were not biological creatures at all, but machines of unknown origin and purpose. One particularly terrifying moment came around midnight. Billy Ray spotted a creature approaching the front window where little Lonnie Langford sat crying on the floor. The thing moved with its arms raised above its head in a posture that seemed almost ceremonial, those clawed hands swaying in the air. Billy Ray fired through the window, hitting it square in what should have been its chest. The creature did not fall backward this time. Instead, it rose up on its hind legs to its full height of perhaps 3.5 feet, those massive eyes glowing brighter for just an instant. And then it floated backward, feet leaving the ground, drifting away into darkness like a balloon released into the night sky. The witness to this defiance of gravity felt something break in his mind, some fundamental understanding of how the world worked, simply shattering under the weight of the impossible. The children's terror fed the adults' fear, and the adults' fear amplified the children's panic, creating a feedback loop of hysteria that built throughout the night. June Taylor, Billy Ray's wife, became nearly catatonic, rocking in a corner and praying in a whisper that never stopped. Aline Langford, Lucky's wife, tried to comfort the children, but her own hands shook so badly she could barely hold them. The youngest child, only 3 years old, screamed herself into exhaustion, and then lay silent and staring, shock settling over her small features. Lucky and Billy Ray took turns watching and shooting, but exhaustion began to wear them down. Their ears rang from the constant gunfire in enclosed spaces. Their shoulders ached from the recoil of weapons fired dozens and dozens of times. Their nerves frayed as each new appearance of the creatures sent fresh jolts of adrenaline through systems already pushed beyond normal limits. They were not soldiers trained for extended combat. They were farm workers and laborers, and their bodies and minds were not prepared for sustained siege warfare. Yet, the siege continued. The creatures would not stop coming. They appeared at the eastern windows, then the western door, then on the roof, then at the northern window, following no pattern the men could predict or defend against. It was as if the entities were playing with them, testing reactions, studying the humans with scientific detachment. Several times, creatures appeared at 2 windows simultaneously, forcing the men to choose which threat to address while leaving their backs vulnerable to the other. Around 2 in the morning, something changed in the nature of the assault. The creatures began appearing closer to the house, lingering longer before retreating, pressing against the screens and windows with more boldness. One reached a clawed hand through a torn screen, the talons scraping against the window glass, with a sound that made everyone in the living room cry out. Lucky fired at it so quickly he barely aimed, and this time when the creature fell away, he heard it hiss in what might have been anger, or might have been laughter. The family discussed attempting to flee, piling into the cars and making a run for town, but the vehicles were parked in the yard, exposed and surrounded. Thought of getting the children outside, into the open darkness where the creatures moved with such speed and confidence, paralyzed the adults with dread. Inside the house they had walls, had lights, had some illusion of shelter, however false that shelter proved to be. Outside was surrender to whatever these things wanted. So they stayed, and the hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, each minute stretched thin by terror. The men's ammunition supplies began to run low. The psychological toll mounted as every strategy failed, as every defensive measure proved inadequate against beings that bullets could not kill and fear could not drive away. They were trapped, prisoners in their own home, under siege by an enemy that defied every natural law, that kept coming back, no matter how many times it was shot, that wanted something from them, even if that something was only their terror and their helplessness. The claustrophobia of the situation pressed in on all of them. The walls that should have protected them became a cage. The familiar rooms of the farmhouse transformed into a trap from which there was no escape and in which there was no real safety. And still the creatures came, appearing and retreating, testing and watching, conducting their inexplicable assault through the deep hours of a Kentucky night that seemed like it would never end. The 8 miles from the Sutton farmhouse to the Hopkinsville police station had never felt longer. 3 cars careened down the dark country roads well past midnight on August 21st, 1955, headlights cutting through the humid Kentucky darkness. Inside those vehicles, 11 people pressed together, some still clutching rifles and shotguns, their hands trembling, their clothes soaked with sweat despite the windows being rolled down. Children whimpered. Adults stared straight ahead, their eyes wide and unblinking. Every shadow along the roadside made them flinch. Every rustle of leaves in the August wind sent a fresh spike of terror through them. They were running from something impossible, something they could barely put into words even to each other. And they were about to tell their story to the police. Chief Russell Greenwell was working the night shift at the Hopkinsville police station when the convoy of cars pulled up outside just after 11 p.m. What he saw when he stepped out to meet them stopped him cold. 11 people spilled out of the vehicles in a state of panic he had rarely witnessed in his years of law enforcement. These were not drunken troublemakers or attention seekers. These were neighbors he knew by name. Billy Ray Taylor, his wife June, Elmer Sutton, and his wife Vera, their son Lonnie, Elaine Sutton, Glennie Langford with her children. Local people, farm people, sober, hardworking folks who kept to themselves, and they were absolutely terrified. Chief Greenwell would later tell reporters that in all his years on the force, he had never seen people so genuinely frightened. Their fear was not the kind that could be faked. It was visceral, primitive, the kind of terror that stripped away all pretense and left raw human survival instinct exposed. Some of them could barely speak. Others talked over each other in a tumbling rush of words that made little sense at first. They gestured wildly. They kept looking back at the darkness beyond the station lights, as if something might materialize at any moment. The story they told seemed to come from the pages of a science fiction magazine, rather than from the quiet farmland of Christian County. Small creatures, they said. silver beings with enormous glowing eyes and raised arms that floated more than walked. The things had come from the darkness shortly after Billy Ray saw something streak across the sky and land in the gully behind the farmhouse. For hours, the family had fought them off, firing at them again and again with shotguns and rifles. The bullets seemed to pass right through them, or bounce off with a metallic sound. The creatures kept coming back, peering in windows, climbing onto the roof, reaching down from the eaves with long clawed hands. Chief Greenwell listened. He studied their faces. He noted the weapons they still carried. He observed how they stayed close together, how the women kept the children pressed against them, how the men kept turning to watch the street. These were not people playing a prank. These were not people seeking publicity. These were people who believed absolutely that they had just survived something beyond explanation. He called for backup immediately. What started as a routine disturbance call rapidly escalated into something unprecedented in the small town's history. Officers from the Hopkinsville Police Department were dispatched. The Kentucky State Police were contacted. Sheriff's deputies prepared to respond. Within the hour, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles was preparing to head out to the Sutton Farm, armed with flashlights, weapons, and a healthy dose of skepticism mixed with genuine concern for what might be waiting in the darkness. The caravan of police cars arrived at the farm around midnight, their headlights and spotlights flooding the property with harsh white light. 4 officers from Hopkinsville, several state troopers and deputies from the sheriff's office fanned out across the property. They moved with caution, weapons drawn, not entirely sure what they were looking for, but taking no chances given the state of the family they had just encountered. What struck them first was the silence. The family had described chaos, gunfire, creatures scrambling across the roof and darting through the shadows. But when the officers arrived, the farm was utterly still. The kind of deep rural quiet that settles over Kentucky farmland in the dead of night, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the occasional call of a night bird. It was peaceful, ordinary, completely at odds with the terror the Suttons and Taylors had described. But as the officers swept their flashlights across the property, the evidence of violence became impossible to ignore. Bullet holes peppered the exterior walls of the farmhouse. The screens on the windows were torn and riddled with buckshot. Shell casings littered the ground, glinting in the beam of flashlights, dozens of them scattered across the yard. The officers counted the holes, counted the casings, and exchanged glances. Whatever had happened here, a tremendous amount of gunfire had been expended in a very short period of time. The trampled areas were next to catch their attention. The ground around the house showed clear signs of disturbance. Flower beds had been crushed. The grass in certain areas was flattened in patterns that suggested something had been moving through repeatedly. Near the back of the house, where Billy Ray claimed to have first encountered one of the creatures at the water pump, the earth was scuffed and disturbed in ways that did not match the footprints of the family members. Then, there were the marks. Strange indentations in the soft earth that did not match any boot or shoe. Small impressions, oddly spaced, leading from the tree line toward the house and then back again. The officers photographed them, measured them, tried to make sense of them. Some appeared almost circular. Others looked like something with limited weight distribution had pressed into the ground. They were not animal tracks of any kind the experienced rural officers recognized. State Trooper George Batts was among those who searched the property most thoroughly. He would later give statements emphasizing that the physical evidence clearly showed something unusual had occurred. The sheer volume of gunfire alone indicated the family had been firing at something repeatedly, not just shooting randomly into the darkness. The pattern of bullet holes suggested targets at different heights and locations around the property. This was not the work of drunk farmers shooting at shadows. This was sustained defensive fire. What they did not find was equally significant. There were no bodies, no blood, no physical remains of any creature. There were no obvious signs of hoax materials, no costumes hidden in the barn, no masks or props that might have been used to stage an elaborate prank. The officers searched outbuildings, checked the tree line, scoured the areas where the family claimed to have hit the creatures multiple times. Nothing. The police interviewed the family members separately, a standard technique to catch inconsistencies in fabricated stories. But the accounts matched. The details aligned. The timeline held together. Each person described the same basic sequence of events, the same appearance of the creatures, the same behavior. The children's accounts matched what the adults reported. There was no evidence of collusion or rehearsed testimony. Officer Batts made a statement that would be quoted in newspapers across the country in the coming days. "These people," he said, "were genuinely frightened. They were sober. They were coherent. They were not the type to make up wild stories or seek attention." Something had happened on that farm that night, something that had driven 11 people to flee their home in absolute terror. Whether it was what they believed it to be was another question entirely, but their fear was unquestionably real. Chief Greenwell echoed this assessment. He knew these families. They were not troublemakers. They were not prone to flights of fancy. The Suttons had lived on that property for years without incident. They were private people who avoided town gossip and kept their business to themselves. For them to come racing into town with this story, they had to believe it absolutely. The search continued until nearly 2 in the morning. Every officer present later reported the same eerie quality to the investigation. The farm was too quiet, too still, as if something had pressed pause on the normal sounds of the night. The family remained in town during the search, too frightened to return even with police presence. When the officers finally concluded their investigation, finding nothing more to document, they assured the family that the property was secure and that whatever had been there was gone now. The Suttons and Taylors returned to the farm reluctantly, exhausted but unable to sleep anywhere else. The police departed around 2 in the morning, their cars disappearing back down the long driveway, their taillights fading into the distance. The family locked the doors, checked the windows, and tried to convince themselves the ordeal was over. It was not over. Less than an hour after the police left, Glennie Langford saw the glow first. That same eerie luminescence in the darkness beyond the windows. Then another family member spotted movement near the tree line. The creatures had returned. The entities that had terrorized them for hours before had waited just long enough for the authorities to leave, and now they were back. The panic that seized the family in that moment was perhaps even worse than before. They had called the police once. They had summoned help and told their impossible story and endured the skepticism and the questions. They could not call again. Who would believe them? Who would respond a second time in the same night to the same impossible claim? They would be labeled insane, attention seekers, frauds. So they did not call. Instead, they armed themselves again, loaded the rifles and shotguns with trembling hands, and prepared to endure. The men positioned themselves at windows. The women gathered the children in the center room, away from exterior walls. And they waited. And he waited. Through the remaining hours of darkness, the family maintained their vigil. They caught glimpses of movement outside. They heard the sounds on the roof that had terrified them earlier, that scratching and sliding of something moving across the shingles. They saw the shapes at the windows, those glowing eyes peering in from the darkness. But they did not fire. They had already shot at these things dozens of times with no apparent effect. All they could do was watch and wait for dawn. The creatures seemed less aggressive this time, more observational. They did not attempt to enter. They did not advance as close to the windows. It was as if they were studying the family now, watching them with an intelligence that was somehow more disturbing than outright aggression. The family stared back, exhausted and terrified, gripping their weapons not because they believed the guns would help, but because holding them provided some small psychological comfort. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep across the Kentucky hills, the creatures withdrew. One by one, the glowing eyes disappeared back into the tree line. The sounds on the roof ceased. The oppressive presence that had hung over the farmhouse for hours lifted gradually, like fog burning off in morning sun. By the time full daylight arrived, the entities were gone completely. The family had survived the night, but they would never be the same. They had experienced something that shattered their understanding of reality. They had called for help and received it, only to face the terror again alone, because the truth was simply too impossible to repeat. And now, as the sun rose on August 22, 1955, they faced a new challenge, convincing the skeptical world that what happened on their quiet Kentucky farm was real. The morning after the siege at the Sutton Farm, the first phone call came just after dawn. Billy Ray Taylor, exhausted and shaken, picked up the receiver to hear a reporter from the Hopkinsville, Kentucky New Kentuckian, demanding details about what really happened. Before he could answer, another line rang. Then another. Within hours, what should have been a private nightmare had become public spectacle. The family hadn't wanted any of this. After spending most of the night at the police station, giving statements that sounded absurd even to their own ears, they returned to find their farm already surrounded. News traveled with shocking speed in 1955, even without the internet or 24-hour cable network. A handful of reporters who monitored police frequencies had caught wind of something extraordinary. A family claiming they had battled creatures from another world. Silver beings with glowing eyes. A siege lasting hours. By noon on August 22nd, the first wave of journalists arrived from nearby counties. Within 48 hours, it became national news. The transformation was brutal and absolute. The Associated Press picked up the story on August 23rd. United Press International followed within hours. Newspapers across the country seized upon it with gleeful abandon. The headlines ranged from curious to cruel. Kentucky family battles spacemen, flying saucer creatures attack farm, Hopkinsville goes Martian mad. Each retelling added new embellishments, stripping away nuance, transforming genuine terror into entertainment for breakfast tables from coast to coast. The media descended on Kelly like locusts. The tiny community, barely a crossroads with a few hundred residents, suddenly found itself hosting reporters from Louisville, Nashville, Chicago, even New York. They came in cars that kicked up dust on the unpaved roads, carrying cameras and notebooks and an insatiable hunger for sensational copy. They knocked on every door, shouted questions at anyone who would listen, and turned the Sutton Farm into ground zero of a journalistic feeding frenzy. The family tried to maintain their dignity. Glennie Langford, the matriarch who had witnessed the entire event, refused most interview requests. When she did speak, her voice trembled with a mixture of fear and frustration. She told the reporters exactly what she had told the police. Strange beings had come to their property. They had glowed in the darkness. Bullets passed through them or bounced off harmlessly. They moved in ways that defied natural law, floating, climbing walls with impossible ease. She described the terror of that night with such raw honesty that even skeptical journalists found themselves momentarily uncertain. But honest testimony doesn't sell newspapers like mockery does. For every respectful article that treated the family's claims seriously, a dozen more turned them into punchlines. Cartoonists had a field day. One widely syndicated comic showed hillbillies shooting at their own moonshine-induced hallucinations. Another depicted little green men fleeing from backwoods yokels wielding shotguns. The underlying message was clear and cruel. These were ignorant country people, probably drunk, definitely delusional, providing urban America with a laugh at their expense. The circus that descended went far beyond journalists. Within a week, the narrow dirt road leading to the Sutton Farm became clogged with traffic at all hours. Curiosity seekers arrived by the hundreds. They came from surrounding counties, from other states, from everywhere within driving distance. Some genuinely wanted to understand what had happened. Most simply wanted to gawk, to stand where something strange had allegedly occurred, to take photographs they could show friends back home. The Air Force arrived quietly, but thoroughly. Personnel from nearby Fort Campbell appeared within days of the incident, conducting interviews under the official guise of investigating potential security concerns. They walked the property, examined the bullet holes riddling the farmhouse walls, measured distances, and took copious notes. Captain Edward Ruppelt, who had led Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, took particular interest in the case. His investigators questioned the witnesses separately and together, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They found none. Every witness, when separated and questioned independently, told the same story with the same details. The times matched. The descriptions aligned. The sequence of events remained consistent across all 7 adults present that night. This consistency troubled the investigators more than contradictions would have. Fabricated stories rarely held together under sustained questioning. Mass hallucinations didn't follow such precise timeline. Whatever these people had experienced, they believed it absolutely. But perhaps most disturbing were the con artists who saw opportunity in tragedy. Within 2 weeks of the incident, enterprising locals began charging admission for tours of the property. The Sutton family never saw a cent from these operations. Strangers simply set up shop on nearby land and directed tourists toward the farm, pocketing 50 cents or $1 per person for the privilege of trespassing. Some claimed to be official guides. Others sold maps to the exact locations where the creatures had allegedly appeared. One particularly brazen opportunist sold what he called authentic alien artifacts, bits of metal and rock he claimed had been left behind by the visitors. The family protested, but what could they do? Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. The sheriff's department in Christian County had neither the resources nor the legal framework to control the madness. Private property laws meant little when hundreds of people simply walked past posted signs, convinced they had a right to see where history had happened. The Suttons sat inside their bullet-riddled farmhouse, prisoners in their own home, watching strangers trample their crops and peer through their windows. Elmer Sutton, known as Lucky to his friends, stopped being lucky the day his story went national. He had served his country, worked hard, and built a modest life. Now reporters called him a liar to his face. His employer received so many inquiries about the crazy spaceman story that Lucky was let go to avoid the disruption. Billy Ray Taylor faced similar consequences. The young man who had first spotted the strange craft found himself unemployed and unmarriageable. What woman wanted to attach herself to the local laughingstock? But the family's ordeal revealed something unexpected. They were not alone in what they had witnessed that night. As the media coverage intensified, other witnesses began emerging from the surrounding area. These secondary accounts came slowly, reluctantly, from people terrified of the ridicule the Suttons now endured daily. A farmer 3 miles south of the Sutton property contacted the Kentucky New Era newspaper under condition of anonymity. He described seeing unusual lights in the sky on the night of August 21st, moving in patterns unlike any aircraft he knew. The lights had hovered, accelerated impossibly fast, then vanished. He had told no one, not even his wife, because who would believe such a thing? Only after reading about the Sutton encounter did he realize he might have witnessed the same phenomenon. A woman from Hopkinsville proper, a school teacher with an impeccable reputation, finally admitted she had seen something strange while driving home that night. Brilliant lights descending toward the area where the Sutton farm was located. Lights that moved with clear purpose and intelligence. She had convinced herself it was some military exercise from Fort Campbell because the alternative was unthinkable. The ridicule heaped upon the Suttons confirmed her decision to remain silent. She only came forward years later, after retiring, when the damage to her reputation no longer mattered. A group of teenagers parked on a country road that night saw the lights too. They had been doing what teenagers did, seeking privacy away from parental oversight, when the sky above them erupted in strange luminescence. Green and silver lights moving in formation. They had driven away fast, hearts pounding, and sworn each other to secrecy. The Sutton story terrified them because it validated what they had witnessed, but they kept silent for decades, until they were middle-aged adults with families of their own. How many others saw something that night and never spoke up? How many looked at what happened to the Sutton family and decided silence was safer than truth? The question haunts the case to this day. The town of Hopkinsville itself fractured along fault lines of belief and skepticism. Some residents defended the Suttons, pointing out their character and consistency. These were not people prone to wild stories or attention-seeking behavior. They were quiet, hardworking, ordinary folks who had experienced something extraordinary and were now paying a terrible price for their honesty. Others mocked relentlessly. The skeptics saw the case as proof that country people were gullible, superstitious, and probably drunk. They made jokes at the diner, at church socials, everywhere the Sutton family members might hear. Children of the family were bullied mercilessly at school. Teachers offered no protection because they too believed the whole thing was ridiculous. Even those who suspended judgment found their lives affected. Businesses in Hopkinsville experienced both blessing and curse from the attention. Some shops saw increased traffic from curiosity seekers passing through. Others suffered as the town became associated with foolishness and rural ignorance. The Chamber of Commerce didn't know whether to embrace or distance themselves from what the newspapers were already calling the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter. The Air Force eventually released its conclusion. The family had witnessed barn owls, they claimed. Great horned owls, to be specific. The glowing eyes were simply the reflection of lantern light. The strange movement patterns were typical owl behavior misinterpreted by frightened, possibly intoxicated witnesses. The metallic appearance was feathers catching light. Every aspect of the encounter could be explained by misidentification of common wildlife, combined with overactive imaginations and possibly alcohol consumption. Never mind that none of the witnesses had been drinking. Never mind that experienced country people knew exactly what owls looked like and how they moved. Never mind that bullets don't bounce off owls or pass through them harmlessly. The official explanation was set, and it was designed to end discussion, not illuminate truth. The human cost of that night in August 1955 cannot be calculated in dollars or quantified in statistics. Within a year, the Sutton family abandoned the farm that had been their home and livelihood. They couldn't endure the constant intrusion, the endless mockery, the economic isolation that came from being the family that claimed they fought aliens. They scattered to different parts of Kentucky and beyond, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by one night of terror and the media circus that followed. They never profited from their story, not 1 cent. Various authors wrote books about the case. Television programs dramatized the events. Researchers built careers studying what happened that night. The family that lived through it gained nothing but pain and loss. Yet, they never recanted, never backed down, never admitted it was owls or hallucinations or a prank. Glennie Langford maintained the truth of her testimony until her death in 1988. Lucky Sutton, Billy Ray Taylor, every witness who survived into old age, they all stood by their original statements. When researchers visited them decades later, expecting the passage of time might have softened certainty or introduced doubt, they found the opposite. The witnesses were more convinced than ever of what they had experienced, more detailed in their memories, more frustrated that the world had chosen mockery over investigation. That unwavering consistency across decades, across separation, across the crushing weight of ridicule, remains one of the most compelling aspects of the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter. These people had everything to gain from recanting and nothing to lose. An admission of mistake or hoax would have restored their reputations, eased their social isolation, perhaps opened doors that mockery had closed. They chose truth as they understood it over comfort. They chose to be believed crazy rather than lie about what they had witnessed. Their farm still stands, though different families have occupied it over the years. The bullet holes have been repaired. The land looks peaceful now, pastoral and unremarkable. Nothing about the property suggests it was once the site of one of the most famous close encounter cases in American history. Nothing except the memories that refuse to die and the questions that remain unanswered. What really happened that night? What did 7 terrified people battle for hours in the darkness? And why did telling the truth cost them everything they had? For 70 years, investigators, skeptics, and believers have tried to explain what happened at the Sutton farmhouse on that August night in 1955. Each theory carries its own weight, its own logic, its own appeal to those who cannot accept the inexplicable. But as with most truly strange events, none of the explanations quite fits all the pieces of the puzzle. The most persistent skeptical explanation centers on a creature that prowls the Kentucky woods every night. The great horned owl theory emerged in the decades following the incident, championed by researchers who believe the Suttons and Langfords simply misidentified common wildlife under conditions of extreme stress and poor visibility. According to this interpretation, the family encountered owls, specifically great horned owls, whose reflective eyes in the beam of flashlights could appear luminous and otherworldly. These powerful birds stand roughly 2 feet tall with impressive wingspans, and their nocturnal hunting behavior includes perching on structures and trees while scanning for prey. Proponents of this theory point out that owls can appear surprisingly humanoid when viewed head-on, with their flat facial discs and forward-facing eyes creating an almost face-like appearance in low-light conditions. The creature's supposed floating or gliding movements could easily be explained by owls taking flight or descending from perches. Even the metallic appearance might be rationalized as moonlight reflecting off wet feathers or the natural iridescence that some owl plumage exhibits under certain lighting conditions. But this tidy explanation begins to crumble under closer scrutiny. The witnesses described entities with distinct arms that reached upward, not wings folded against bodies. They described creatures that walked upright on two legs, moving behind trees and buildings with apparent intelligence and curiosity, behavior fundamentally different from hunting owls. The size presents another problem. While great horned owls are indeed large birds, 2 feet of height hardly accounts for the 3 to 4 feet the witnesses consistently reported, especially when describing creatures that walked on legs rather than perched. Most damaging to the owl theory is the physical evidence. The family fired directly at these entities at close range with shotguns and rifles. Owl bodies are fragile. A direct hit from a 20-gauge shotgun would have left feathers, blood, and very likely a dead or injured bird. Yet the weapons seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Witnesses described hearing metallic pinging sounds, like bullets striking a tin roof or steel drum, when their shots connected. Billy Ray Taylor insisted he heard the distinctive sound of metal being struck, a detail he maintained for the rest of his life. No owl, no matter how large or impressively plumed, makes a metallic sound when shot. The creatures also displayed persistence and apparent coordination that goes beyond animal behavior. They returned multiple times throughout the night, approaching from different directions, seeming to observe the family rather than flee from the repeated gunfire. Owls, like virtually all wild animals, instinctively avoid human confrontation and would certainly flee from the noise and muzzle flash of firearm. The extraterrestrial hypothesis carries a different kind of weight. In the 1950s, the Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter was far from isolated. Researchers who study historical UFO reports have noted a striking pattern of small humanoid sightings during this period. In France alone, during a wave of sightings in 1954, witnesses described similar small beings with oversized heads and luminous eyes. In South America, rural farmers reported encounters with diminutive entities that emerged from glowing objects in fields. In the United States, other Kentucky residents reported strange crafts and small figures in the years surrounding the Sutton incident. The beings described at Kelly fit a template that would become eerily familiar to UFO researchers. They were small, between 3 and 4 feet tall, with disproportionately large heads and huge eyes. Their skin appeared metallic or silvery. They moved in ways that seemed to defy normal physics, seemingly unaffected by gravity or physical barriers. Their apparent invulnerability to weapons suggested technology or biology far beyond human understanding. The craft that Billy Ray and Lucky saw earlier that evening, glowing as it descended into the gully, provides context that the owl theory simply cannot address. Multiple witnesses saw this object before the entities appeared. The timing suggests a connection that skeptics dismiss but cannot fully explain away. Those who support the extraterrestrial explanation point to the consistency of small humanoid reports across different continents and cultures during this era. How could rural farmers in Kentucky, French villagers, and South American witnesses all describe such similar beings if they were merely misidentifying local wildlife? The lack of communication between these witnesses, the absence of mass media saturation at the time, makes parallel invention or mass delusion unlikely. The Kelly entities behaved with apparent intelligence and purpose. They approached the house repeatedly, observed the family, and withdrew when met with aggression, only to return from different angles. This suggests reconnaissance or study rather than random animal activity. Yet another explanation whispers through the margins of the case, darker and more earthbound. Fort Campbell Military Base sits just a handful of miles from Kelly. In 1955, the Cold War was accelerating into new and frightening territory. Military experiments pushed boundaries that civilian populations could scarcely imagine. Some researchers have quietly suggested that what the Suttons encountered might have been related to classified military projects. Perhaps experimental aircraft being tested under cover of darkness. Perhaps beings in protective suits conducting radiation studies or testing equipment that would give soldiers advantages in future conflicts. The metallic appearance could have been hazmat suits or early versions of protective gear. The glowing eyes might have been night vision equipment or reflective lenses. The apparent invulnerability to bullets could be explained by advanced armor plating in an era when such technology was rapidly developing. The entity's small stature might have been children or small adults selected for experimental programs, or possibly test dummies being controlled remotely, early prototypes of what would eventually become drone technology. This theory appeals to those who prefer conspiracies to cosmic visitors, who find government cover-ups more plausible than interplanetary travel. It would explain why military personnel might have visited the area, though no official records confirm this. It would explain the reluctance of some witnesses to speak freely, possibly warned off by authorities who needed to protect classified operations. But the military explanation also struggles against the facts. No credible evidence has ever emerged connecting Fort Campbell to the incident. No deathbed confessions from soldiers, no declassified documents, no whistleblowers coming forward in the 7 decades since the event. The technology described seems fantastically advanced even for classified military research in the 1950s. Suits that could withstand direct shotgun blasts at close range, that could create a metallic pinging sound when struck, that allowed wearers to float or move with the fluidity witnesses described. This would represent a leap in material science that apparently was never deployed in any subsequent military application. If such technology existed in 1955, why do we not see evidence of its evolution in later decades? The behavior of the entities also seems counterproductive for military testing. Why target a random farmhouse full of civilians? Why return repeatedly despite being fired upon? Why leave no trace, no equipment, no footprints beyond the few strange marks investigators found? The simplest explanation, the one that skeptics return to most often, is that the whole event was an elaborate hoax. 8 people, the reasoning goes, concocted a story to gain attention, perhaps hoping for profit, or simply enjoying the excitement of a manufactured mystery. The hoax theory has a cynical appeal in our media-saturated age, where people fabricate stories for fame with depressing regularity. But this explanation fails more comprehensively than any other when examined closely. Consider the profit motive first. The Sutton and Langford families gained nothing financially from their experience. They refused money for interviews. They turned down opportunities to commercialize their story. When curiosity seekers descended on their property in the days and weeks following the incident, trampling crops and creating chaos, the family saw only loss. Glennie Langford eventually sold the farm and moved away, the intrusion and mockery becoming unbearable. These were poor rural people who could have desperately used money, yet they consistently refused payment for their account. If this was a hoax designed for profit, it was the most financially unsuccessful fraud in history. The consistency of their stories over decades presents another insurmountable problem for the hoax theory. The witnesses were interviewed separately by police, military personnel, and investigators on the night of the incident. Their accounts aligned in essential details despite the chaos and fear they were experiencing. In the years and decades that followed, researchers returned to question them again. The stories never changed in their fundamentals. Billy Ray Taylor, until his death, maintained every detail of what he saw. Lucky Sutton never wavered. Even the children, when they grew to adulthood, confirmed what they remembered from that night. 8 people maintaining an identical fabrication across 70 years without a single contradiction or confession strains credulity beyond the breaking point. Hoaxes fall apart. People forget details, embellish differently. Eventually someone admits the truth. None of that happened here. The police corroboration cannot be dismissed. Officers Greenwell and Baker arrived expecting to find drunk yokels or attention seekers. Instead, they found a family in genuine terror, with physical evidence of a violent encounter. The house bore the marks of gunfire. Spent shells littered the property. The witnesses showed physiological signs of extreme fear, sweating and shaking and pale. These were experienced officers who had seen their share of liars and troublemakers. They found the family credible. They saw no evidence of intoxication or mental instability. They noted details that suggested something genuinely frightening had occurred, even if they could not explain what. The multiplicity of witnesses creates a mathematical improbability for the hoax theory. One person fabricating a story is easy to imagine. 2 people maintaining a conspiracy is possible. But 8 people of different ages, including children, all perfectly coordinating a complex lie, maintaining it under pressure from authorities and investigators, never breaking character, or revealing the truth even in private moments over the course of 7 decades, this approaches impossibility. Children especially are poor liars, unable to maintain complex fabrications under questioning. Yet, the children's accounts match the adults. So we are left in a space of profound uncertainty. The owl theory cannot account for the physical evidence, the size and behavior of the entities, or the metallic sounds. The extraterrestrial hypothesis asks us to accept visitors from other worlds, a leap many find impossible despite the consistent patterns in similar reports. The military explanation lacks any supporting evidence and requires technology that seems too advanced for the era. The hoax theory crumbles under the weight of the witnesses' consistency, the lack of profit motive, and the police corroboration. Each explanation illuminates part of the mystery while leaving other aspects in deeper shadow. Perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all, that some events resist our attempts to categorize them, to fit them into comfortable boxes of known phenomena or human deception. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter remains balanced on the knife edge between possible explanations, satisfying none of them completely, leaving us to wonder what really walked out of the Kentucky darkness on that August night in 1955. Listen. Can you hear it? That soft patter against the roof, the whisper of water falling through darkness. It's just rain, you tell yourself. Just another summer storm rolling across the Kentucky countryside. But there's something about that sound, that rhythm of raindrops in the night, that brings us back to August of 1955, when something unexplainable visited a small farm near Hopkinsville, and left behind questions that 70 years have failed to answer. The physical evidence has never been explained. Bullet holes riddled the farmhouse walls. Claw marks scarred the window screens. The ground showed disturbances where the family swore the creatures had landed. Law enforcement documented it all. Investigators photographed it. Skeptics examined it. And no one could definitively explain away what they found. These weren't fabrications or misidentifications. Something real left those marks. Multiple witnesses, people with no reason to lie, maintained their stories until death. They passed polygraph tests. They endured ridicule and scrutiny. And their accounts never wavered. 11 people saw the same impossible things that night. Farmers, children, grown adults, all describing beings that shouldn't exist, creatures that seemed impervious to shotgun blasts at point-blank range. That invulnerability remains one of the deepest mysteries. Billy Ray Taylor and Lucky Sutton were experienced shooters, men who knew their weapons. They fired directly at these entities, watched them tumble backward from the impact, only to see them float gently to the ground and scurry away unharmed. What were these things that bullets couldn't stop? Were they physical beings at all, or something else entirely? Something that occupied space differently than we understand? But perhaps the most haunting question is the simplest one. Why that farm? Why that family? The Suttons were ordinary people living in ordinary rural life. They had no interest in the unexplained, no history of strange encounters. What drew those creatures to that specific location on that specific night? Some researchers believe the answer lies in the rain itself. They've noted a pattern across decades of similar encounters. Rural areas, summer storms, and entities that appear during electrical disturbances. The night the creatures came to the Sutton Farm, rain had been falling. The air was charged, heavy with moisture and atmospheric pressure. Were these beings drawn by conditions we don't yet understand? Do certain weather patterns create openings, doorways between their world and ours? Other cases seem to support this theory. Across the rural United States, witnesses have reported strange visitors during thunderstorms, beings that vanish when the weather clears. Could rain and electricity somehow thin the barriers between realities? The Sutton farmhouse still stands today, weathered by decades but recognizable. And on rainy Kentucky nights, locals who know the story still avoid that stretch of road. They drive past quickly, eyes forward, unwilling to look too long at the darkened fields where something impossible once walked. Because the real terror isn't what happened 70 years ago. It's the possibility that whatever came that August night might still be out there, waiting in the spaces between storms, watching for the right atmospheric conditions to return. The rain still falls on Kentucky. The storms still roll across those dark fields. And we still don't know what they were, or why they came, or if they're done with us yet. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.